safety again. She tracked Mason down at the cannery that afternoon, demanding answers about who he was and why he had been watching. And instead of deflecting, he told her a partial truth, that he believed certain men in town were connected to something darker than drunken harassment, that he had reason to think young women passing through the coast had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and that last night might have exposed more than a single crime. Emily listened, anger giving way to cold clarity as she recalled seeing unfamiliar vans parked near the docks at odd hours, remembering a college acquaintance who had taken a summer job in a neighboring town and never returned calls. And she realized the three men hadn't chosen her randomly. They had tested her, gauged the environment, confident that isolation was their ally. Mason warned her to stay out of it, but Emily had inherited stubbornness alongside grief, and she insisted that if something was festering in Blackridge, she wouldn't pretend blindness. Over the next week, an uneasy alliance formed, Emily feeding Mason observations from the marina, while Mason coordinated quietly with federal contacts who could not yet justify an overt operation. And the more they dug, the more threads emerged. Shell companies tied to a seafood distribution warehouse, night. Shipments logged without cargo manifests. The same three men bailed out faster than seemed possible and seen back at the docks with fresh confidence. The twist came when Emily discovered that the warehouse property was co-owned by Councilman Robert Gaines, a polished local politician who chaired the town's economic development board and had publicly championed revitalizing the waterfront. And when Mason pulled background intel, he found Gaines's name adjacent to investigations that had dissolved in bureaucratic fog across 2 states. The trap was set on a humid Friday when the warehouse lights burned past midnight and an unmarked van backed to the loading bay. Emily, positioned in her uncle's small skiff offshore with binoculars, felt nausea rise as she spotted 2 frightened young women being hurried inside, their hands not visibly bound, but their movements too constrained to be voluntary, and she whispered coordinates into the encrypted phone Mason had provided. What she didn't know was that Gaines had suspected surveillance and planted his own countermeasure, a lookout who trailed Emily's skiff with a smaller motorboat. And by the time Mason breached the warehouse with a tactical team assembled under the guise of a Coast Guard inspection, Emily found herself intercepted on the dark water, engine choked by a sabotaged fuel line, the lookout grinning as he drew alongside and told her she should have minded her own business. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but she remembered Mason's instruction, create noise, create time, and she fired a flare straight into the sky, a streak of red tearing open the night, visible for miles, and the lookout cursed, lunging to grab her arm. But before he could drag her across the gunwale, a spotlight snapped on from the pier, and a voice amplified by command cut through the chaos, ordering him to stand down. Mason had anticipated a perimeter breach, and within minutes, the marina swarmed. With federal agents, the warehouse doors burst open, and the carefully curated respectability of Robert Gaines collapsed under the weight of handcuffs and live cameras, because Mason had tipped off a national investigative journalist hours earlier, ensuring that even if local influence tried to bury the case, the spotlight would make burial impossible. In the aftermath, as dawn bled pale gold over Blackridge, the rescued women were wrapped in blankets and guided to waiting ambulances. The 3 original attackers were rearrested under federal charges, and Councilman Gaines's empire unraveled in a cascade of seized assets and sealed indictments. Emily stood on the pier exhausted, salt drying on her skin, and Mason approached not as a warrior but as a man, finally allowing himself to exhale. And he told her the truth he had withheld, that her father had once served under him, that the elder Harper had saved his life during a mission overseas, and that when Mason learned rumors of trafficking had surfaced in Blackridge, he felt a debt he could no longer ignore. Emily absorbed the revelation like a second sunrise, grief reshaping into something steadier, realizing that the night those men claimed she wasn't a girl anymore, they had unknowingly triggered a reckoning engineered years before, forged in loyalty and loss. But the final twist lay deeper. Among the documents seized from Gaines's office was a ledger detailing payments to officials beyond Blackridge, a network stretching into larger cities, and Mason was offered a choice: to close this operation as a clean victory or pursue the wider web at significant personal risk. He chose the latter, of course, and when he prepared to leave town, he asked Emily to stay vigilant, to be the eyes of a community that had almost been devoured by complacency, and she surprised him by declining the role of passive guardian, instead applying to the Federal Maritime Enforcement Program inspired by what she had witnessed, determined that her survival would not be her defining trait, but her catalyst. Months later, when trials commenced and national headlines labeled the takedown a landmark case against coastal trafficking, commentators focused on the Navy SEAL who dismantled a ring with surgical precision. Yet those who knew the truth understood that the story began with a young woman refusing to bow her head, with a flare fired into darkness, with a community forced to confront the monsters hiding behind civic smiles. And somewhere beyond the shoreline, Mason boarded a transport to his next assignment, carrying with him the knowledge that justice, like the tide, may retreat, but always returns, especially when men mistake cruelty for power. So remember this, America. Predators count on silence, on isolation, on the lie that no one is coming. But sometimes a warrior is already watching. Sometimes a daughter carries her father's courage in her bones. And sometimes the night they come hunting is the night they become the hunted. Stop scrolling, America. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a warning, a reckoning, and a promise that evil doesn't always win. If you believe courage still lives in this country, if you believe monsters should fear the night, then subscribe now and stand with the stories that prove justice still has teeth. Because this is the night they thought she was powerless, and the night they learned they were wrong. It started in the quiet coastal town of Blackridge, North Carolina, where the marsh grass whispered in the wind and old fishing boats groaned against their ropes like tired men with secrets. Emily Harper had just turned 23, a marine biology graduate with salt in her hair and defiance in her spine. The kind of woman who carried herself with calm intelligence, but whose eyes held storms no one bothered to read. And on the evening it happened, she was closing up the small bait and tackle shop she ran for her uncle while he recovered from surgery, unaware that 3 men leaning against a rusted pickup across the street had already decided she was a prize to be taken rather than a person to be respected. They had been drinking, their laughter too loud for the hour, their eyes following her movements with a hunger that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with domination. And when the last customer left and the open sign flicked dark, the street seemed to empty, in a way that felt orchestrated, like the tide pulling back before a violent wave. Emily sensed something wrong the moment she stepped outside, keys threaded between her fingers the way her father had once taught her. But her father had been dead 3 years, buried with full military honors for a service record she never fully understood. And she had learned since then that grief sharpened instinct. The men pushed off the truck and spread out just enough to close distance without looking coordinated, their words slick and mocking, telling her she wasn't a little girl anymore, telling her the world was about experiences and they were here to give her one. And though none of their threats were explicit, the intent dripped from every syllable, from the way one reached to block her path and another circled behind, from the smirk that said they believed no one would stop them. What they didn't know, what no one in Blackridge knew, was that a man had been watching from the second-story window of the abandoned cannery across the street, a man who had arrived in town 2 weeks earlier under the name Daniel Reed, renting a modest cottage and keeping to himself, telling neighbors he was between contracts as a private maritime security consultant, when in truth Chief Petty Officer Mason Reaper Cole, United States Navy SEAL, had come for a different reason entirely, drawn by whispers of a trafficking route using small coastal towns as pickup points. And he had been mapping faces, vehicles, routines, waiting for proof before striking. When he saw the 3 men converge on Emily, he didn't hesitate, because sometimes proof comes disguised as a scream swallowed by the night. Mason moved like a shadow falling downhill, silent and inevitable, his boots barely kissing pavement before he closed the distance, and the first man never saw him until the world snapped sideways in a blur of motion and he was face first against the hood of his own truck, breath punched from his lungs. The second swung wildly, fueled by alcohol and ego, but Mason intercepted the arm, twisted, and the sound that followed was the unmistakable crack of a joint pushed beyond its loyalty. The third tried to run, suddenly aware that the hunt had reversed, but Mason was faster, cutting him off with a precision that spoke of years in places where hesitation meant coffins. And when it was done, the 3 men lay groaning in the street, their bravado drained into the gutter along with their bloodied pride, while Emily stood frozen, heart hammering, staring at the stranger who had materialized like vengeance given human form. Mason didn't look at her right away. He zip-tied the men with practiced efficiency, checked for weapons, and only then turned, his expression not heroic but controlled, as if violence were a language he spoke fluently but preferred not to use unless necessary. And he asked her calmly if she was hurt. She shook her head, words tangled behind shock. and sirens began to wail in the distance because Mason had already triggered a silent alert through a contact at the county sheriff's office. A contact who trusted him more than paperwork. When deputies arrived, they found not a bar fight, but a scene curated for prosecution. Complete with dashcam footage Mason had discreetly captured using a micro device clipped to his collar, and while the three men spat threats about knowing people and getting out by morning, the sheriff himself stepped from his cruiser with a look that suggested this night would not end the way they expected. Blackridge buzzed the next day, rumors spreading faster than the gulls over the pier, some painting Emily as reckless for closing alone, others whispering about the mysterious newcomer who dismantled 3 grown men without raising his voice. And Emily found herself both grateful and unsettled, because gratitude implied debt, and she had sworn never to owe anyone her.